Okay, today we're going to finish our third lecture on bonding, and this is going to be talking about theories behind covalent bonding. And it's going to seem kind of complicated, and some of these things are difficult to visualize, but I think you should just try to make sure you understand what we're asking, and then if you want to think about it longer and see if you can figure out the actual process behind it, then you can do that. So let's talk about the valence bond theory. The valence bond theory states that a covalent bond occurs with the overlap of two half-filled orbitals. Now, obviously, we've talked about this. We've said that electrons tend to go in pairs, and those pairs result when you have orbitals that have one electron in from each atom, and then they become shared. And so this is what results in the valence bond theory. And this overlap is the portion of one orbital that overlaps with the second portion of a second orbital. And they occupy this region together. The electrons occupy this region of overlap. Now, how this occurs is that when you have two hydrogen atoms, and if you look at the right here first, you see that they have a fairly significant distance apart from each other. And as they come closer together, there's still no overlap, but there's an attraction or an interaction that begins to occur, and the energy level begins to fall. And when they're at the optimum distance from each other, they reach the lowest energy level, which is the most stable energy level. And that occurs when the bond length, or the distance between them, is approximately 74 picometers. And so this process occurs in such a way that these orbitals interact, and they're always trying to achieve the lowest energy level because that represents the most stable energy level. And so A here shows the overlap of two p orbitals. And the p orbitals have the greatest or the best overlap when they actually overlap end to end. If you compare A to B, you see that the amount of overlap is less. And the black dots, by the way, represent the nuclei. And so these regions, when they overlap each other, if they overlap end to end like this, then they tend to have the best overlap, or the greatest overlap. And anything else tends to have less in terms of the ability to share. So a sigma bond forms when you have an overlap of two s orbitals, an s and a p orbital, or two p orbitals end to end. Now, as we'll see, there are also side-to-side interactions that are not sigma bonds. Again, in this diagram, the black dots indicate nuclei. And so these are three. The first one, A, represents two s orbitals overlapping. The second, B, represents an s and a p orbital overlapping. And then C represents an s or two p orbitals. Now, the pi bonds occur when you have two orbitals that are beside each other, and they overlap side to side. For example, let's just say these are in the y-axis, both of these. And they're not end-to-end overlapping, but they're side-to-side overlapping. And again, the black dots represent the location of the nuclei. A node is a plane where there is no probability of finding an electron. And in this diagram, this would be the white space in between the two dots. So if you were to look at various configurations, you would see that, for example, on the left here, hydrochloric acid has one overlap of the s orbital from the hydrogen and a p orbital from the chlorine. This represents a sigma bond, but there are no pi bonds. When a double bond occurs, the first bond is a sigma bond, the second bond is a pi bond. And when a triple bond occurs, you have one sigma bond, which is the first end-to-end, and then the other two represent two pi bonds. So oxygen, because it has a double bond, has one sigma bond and one pi bond. And nitrogen, because it has a triple bond, has one sigma bond and two pi bonds. So if you were to look at this molecule, which is butadiene, you could count how many sigma and how many pi bonds there are. So here we have 9 sigma bonds, the 6 single bonds that are between each carbon and hydrogen, 1 sigma bond between the carbon, and then 2 double bonds, 2 in the double bonds. So for example, here you have 1 sigma bond, here you have 1 sigma bond, and here you have 1 sigma bond. So that's 3. And then out here you have 6 more, so there's a total of 9. You have 2 double bonds, and so you have 2 pi bonds, one here and one here. Now theoretically or hypothetically, if you were to combine oxygen with hydrogen forming water, you would have a situation shown in this diagram where the 1s1 electron that's in the hydrogen overlaps with the 2p electrons in the oxygen. Now, if this were to occur, the bond angle should be 90 degrees. However, this is not consistent with the experimental evidence, and as you remember from last week's lecture, the VSEPR theory says that 90 degrees is not the most geometrically stable. So what happens, or how does this change? It's a process known as hybridization. A hybridization is the linear combination of atomic orbital functions. Now what that means is that the S and the P get together and they both contribute, and you end up with 2 sp orbitals. And I'm going to show you how that works in just a minute. A hybrid orbital is the new orbital that is formed as a result of these combinations. And we're going to go through several examples because this is not a particularly easy concept to visualize. So if you remember, when the tetrahedral situation is formed, you start out with an oxygen that has 4 areas, 2 of which are filled with pairs of electrons and 2 of which have electrons available for bonding. When they do bond with the hydrogen, the angle changes a little bit, and that's because in the process of bonding, these orbitals on the oxygen hybridize and the angle changes. So the water molecule has 4 regions of electron density. So the VSEPR theory would predict a tetrahedral arrangement with a 109.5 angle. You remember that for last week. However, the 2 bonding orbitals that actually bond are hybrid orbitals of the oxygen that contain an electron, and these overlap with the 1s orbital from the hydrogen. And this forms the bonds that occur. Now, because these are hybrids, the bond angle is slightly different, and this description is consistent with the experimental evidence. So, let's review for a minute the important ideas behind the hybrid orbital formation. The first one is the fact that hybrid orbitals do not exist when the atom is isolated. So when the atom is isolated, it has an s orbital and a p orbital, or it'll have s orbital, p orbital, d orbital. But these hybrid orbitals only occur when it's bonded covalently with another atom. The hybrid orbital have shapes and orientations that are different than the isolated atoms. And so, as I said, if you look at oxygen, for example, if it were by itself, it has a 90-degree angle. If you think of, the 1s2, 2s2, 2p6, or 2p4, I guess, you have each of those p orbitals are oriented in 90 degrees with each other in space. But when they bond, the hybrid orbitals are different in both shape and orientation, and that angle goes from 90 degrees to 104 degrees or 109 degrees. The hybrid orbital is generated by combining the atomic orbitals. So what happens is that a P and an S combine together to create something called an SP, or the P and two P's and an S get together and they combine to form 3 sp2 orbitals, and so forth. So the number of orbitals is equal to the sum of the atomic orbitals used to make the set. So if you use 1 p and 1 s, you have 2 sp orbitals. If you use 1 p and 2 p's and 1 s, you have 3 sp2 orbitals. And if you use 1 s and 3 p's, you have 4 sp3 orbitals. All the orbitals that occur, the hybrid orbitals, have the same energy and the same shape. And the type of hybrid orbital that is formed is dependent on its electron pair geometry, depending on VSEPR. And we'll show that dependence in future slides. Hybrid orbitals then are free to form sigma bonds, and unhybridized orbitals can form pi bonds. So sigma bonds form with hybrid orbitals. Pi bonds form with unhybridized orbitals. So here's an example of a hybrid orbital that is formed. You have beryllium, which has 1s2, 2s2. And so you have, basically, you have empty p shells. That what is shown here is the p along the x-axis. The circle, this is all on the left of the diagram here. The circle is the 2 electrons in the s orbital. The dumbbell looking thing right next to it is the x-oriented p orbital. So it would be 2px0. So what happens is that the s and the p mix together and form sp, 2 sp orbitals. And these are shown on the right, one oriented to the left of 0 and one oriented to the right of 0. And each of those big yellow blobs represents the new hybrid orbital. So you have 2 sp orbitals. And these 2 sp orbitals are now open to bond with other molecules or other atoms, and the bonding angle will be 180 degrees. And this shows what the geometry looks like. You start out on the left here with empty 2p orbital and 2 electrons in the 2s orbital. After hybridization occurs, you end up with 2 sp orbitals, each of which has an electron available for bonding or sharing, and 2 2p orbitals that are unhybridized. And so what you have is a combination of the s with one of the 2p orbitals. And so when this bonds with chlorine, it forms sigma bonds. The electrons that are available on the chlorine form sigma bonds with each of these 2p orbitals, thus forming a linear 180 degree bonding angle. And each of the sp orbitals now holds a pair of electrons, one of which came from the 2s of the beryllium and the other of which came from the 3p orbital of chlorine. And so once the bonding occurs, you'll have in each of these sp lines that are shown here, you'll have a pair of electrons. Now this shows the hybridization of a p or 2p orbitals with 1s. So you start out, here's boron. Boron again has 2 electrons in the 2s and 1 electron in the 2p. And the 1 electron we can say is in the 2px, but you also have available 2py. And the hybridization occurs forming a sp2 hybridization orbital, Each sp2 hybridization orbital is shown on the right of the slide. One is oriented on the x-axis on the left, one is oriented on the x-axis on the right, and one is oriented on the y-axis. And this gives that trigonal planar arrangement with a bonding angle of 120 degrees. Now the remaining p orbital, which is not hybridized, is oriented along the z-axis. And so when boron binds with hydrogen, each of these sp2 orbitals bonds with the s1 electron and forms a trigonal planar structure BH3 with a bonding angle of 120 degrees.